welcome back to the Washington Outsider Report on the Coalition Radio. For those newly joining the program, my name is Irina Zuckerman, and I am the editor-in-chief of the Washington Outsider. With us today is Michael D. Greaney. He is the Director of Research for the Interfaith Center for Economic and Social Justice based in Arlington, Virginia. And we'll be discussing a little bit of a obscure topic, which I think is gaining prominence in some circles, which is the discussion of banking and how banking has failed in its mission, and why that is the case, and whether it can actually still play a helpful role. And we'll talk about it in the context of assisting the poor, developing communities, as well as various independence movements, human rights defenders, and other marginalized and vulnerable populations and demographics around the world. We first met with Mr. Greaney at an event in Washington focused on the plight of Russian ethnic minorities. And one of the issues facing these very diverse populations is the issue of economic development of their region and what can be done to empower them, to give them some sort of a self-sufficiency. And that's the context from which this topic has emerged. Thank you so much for joining the Washington Outsider today. Before we delve into the heart of this matter, could you tell us a little bit about yourself, the center, and how you came to be working in this area?
Yes. As Irina said, I'm Director of Research for the Interfaith Center for Economic and Social Justice. It's a think tank / educational institution that was founded in 1984. So this is our 40th year. I ended up in Washington, DC. Arlington is in the suburbs of Washington, of course, as you know. I ended up here when I came to Washington from Evansville, Indiana, in the middle of the country, to work for the American Red Cross. I started in the Red Cross chapter in Evansville, Indiana, where I went to school. I went to school at the University of Notre Dame in the northern part of the state, and then got my master's degree in the University of Evansville in the southern part of the state. So I couldn't seem to get out of the state. But then my mother worked for the American Red Cross as a registered nurse phlebotomist for their blood program. So I worked for that briefly and found a job with national headquarters in Washington, D.C. And after a big reorganization there and a stint in the Federal Election Commission in the federal government, I ended up working with a company called Equity Expansion International, which is a for-profit organization that implements and administers employee stock ownership plans, and also develops plans for international development to help disadvantaged countries catch up to the, I guess you call them, advantaged countries. And what Equity Expansion International was formed to do was to implement the policies and procedures developed by the Interfaith Center for Economic and Social Justice, which is a nonprofit, which was founded to combine two things that you might think are very unlikely to put together. One, what is called the expanded ownership ideas of a man named Louis Kelso, who invented the employee stock ownership plan, who developed his theories in conjunction with the Aristotelian philosopher Mortimer J. Adler. He was very big on education. You may have heard of him. He taught philosophy of law at University of Chicago and was the editor of the Synopticon for the Encyclopedia Britannica. And if I start talking about Adler, I could go on for the entire length of the show. But my associate, and who is also my business associate, who is also president of the Center for Economic and Social Justice, CESJ, worked with Louis Kelso and met with Mortimer Adler, and decided that when he came across a man named Father William Ferree, who was rector of Dayton University, which is a Catholic university, who was an expert in the field of social justice. Now, what CESJ does for its Just Third Way is put together the economic and philosophical ideas of Louis Kelso and Mortimer Adler with this with Catholic social thought, which to call it Catholic social thought is something of a misnomer because it's not really Catholic. It's for everybody since it's based on the natural law, principles of basic justice. And what Father Ferry taught us was that social justice is not what most people think it is. Most people think of social justice as government programs or doing good on a broad scale. No, social justice is the justice concerned with making it possible to do good things. It doesn't mean doing them itself. It's a very subtle approach. I mean, do you see what I mean? Most people are going to confuse making it possible to do something with actually doing something. But this is why we call CESJ the Center for Economic and Social Justice, because we know what to do with economic justice. Basically, make everybody an owner so that they can get income from owning capital as well as from labor, or if you can't work at all, to get income from owning capital, rather than sit around and wait for the government to do it for you. And what social justice does is make it possible for people to own capital. It doesn't just redistribute. That's socialism does that. You can see how well that's worked. So, yeah, I can tell by your laugh. Not at all. Well, no, actually, socialism is sometimes necessary in the short run. Suppose everything falls apart and people just cannot take care of themselves because there's a disaster. Well, then it's legitimate for people to pool their money and whatever else they need and to help other people in an emergency. But socialism can only work in the short term as an emergency. Now, you might say that I'm advertising for capitalism. No, because capitalism is not exactly the opposite of socialism. Capitalism is simply socialism in the private sector, because in socialism, the government owns or controls everything. In capitalism, a few people own or control everything. And as you've seen in places like Russia, private sector owners who own everything tend to become the government. So you may call it whatever you want to, but it's still socialism, or maybe socialist capitalism or capitalist socialism. The basic problem, as Louis Kelso saw it, and this was the same problem that the people who developed Catholic social thought saw, is that concentrated power is bad. Anytime you have concentrated power, you're asking for trouble. You may hold the line for a while, but as Lord Acton said over 150 years ago, or actually he was quoting somebody else, power tends to corrupt. Absolute power corrupts absolutely. Now, as American statesman Daniel Webster said, back in 1820, when they were debating on whether they should give the vote to adult white males who don't own property, you can see we've come a little bit further since then. He said, we can't give the vote to people who own property because power follows property, naturally and necessarily. If we give the vote to people who do not own property, they'll use it to take property from the people who do have it. And in a sort of sideways way, that is what has happened. Back in 1820, Alexis de Tocqueville, who visited the United States in the 1830s, said, the people in America are so independent and they control their own lives to such a degree that it's almost as if the government isn't there. Well, you can see what has happened in the interim. As people lost property and thus power, the government has, of necessity, it wasn't some big conspiracy, although you'll find people who say this, the government has taken over more and more and more of life and the economy, so that I think, what is it? The U.S. government spending controls about half of the American economy. 100 years ago, it controlled about 12%, and people thought it was too much. Now it controls about half. It wasn't because it wanted to, but this is the way things worked out because 50 years ago, they didn't listen to Louis Kelso. Louis Kelso and Mortimer Adler published a book in 1958, worst title in the world, except for the other one, which was, they called it the Capitalist Manifesto.
Oh.
Yes, better than the Communist Manifesto, but there were good reasons for it in the 1950s because you had the communist scare and all these other things going on. So Capitalist Manifesto sounded like a good title. Well, not today, because we've been having trouble trying to name what we're talking about. And I think the best name we came up with was economic personalism. Pope John Paul II talked about personalism. And so this is focus on the sovereignty and dignity of each human person. And so what we talk about is economic personalism, so that the economic system, and of course the financial system, which is what we'll be segueing into, should support the dignity and sovereignty of every single human person, regardless of race, creed, color, religion, or where you are anywhere in the world. The world was made for human beings. Human beings weren't made for the world. They used to say, the state is made for man, not man for the state. Well, we don't have to say just man. We can include women and children, everybody. All these governments, all these power brokers, all these corporations, all the states, everywhere in the world, they are nothing compared with the dignity and sovereignty of the individual human person. The only reason to have them is to support each. Aristotle would say, the meaning and purpose of life is to become more fully human, which is a way how he said to become virtuous. Virtue actually means humanness. So our job here on earth is to become more fully human. Now, your culture, your upbringing, your religion, your philosophy may make you differ from how you define more fully human from a lot of other people in details. But the essence of being more fully human is to have access to the right. This is how you do it. You become virtuous by exercising your natural rights to life, liberty, and access to the means of acquiring and possessing private property. See, private property, as you will, as an attorney know, is not the thing you own. It's the natural right you have to become an owner, and the bundle of rights that you have to over the thing you own, the right to exclude or include or do anything else and receive the fruits of ownership. The big problem today is, how do you become an owner? And that's how we get into the banking and finance system, because most people aren't smart enough to select their right parents. I mean, I forgot to pick rich parents. I'm sure you did too. So, and I'm not stumbling over anything in the street that I can use to acquire property. So it looks like I'll have to have access to money and credit one way or another. And as long as people have certain flawed assumptions that they have inherited for the past 200 years, most people aren't going to be able to have access to money and credit. And that was the main question Louis Kelso and Mortimer Adler addressed. How do we define money? What is money? How do we gain access to money? Is it just so we can have money and thus power? No. It's so that every single person on earth eventually can become an owner of capital and thereby acquire power, not over others, but over themselves, so that they can exercise their inherent sovereignty and realize their true human dignity. Have I made a good enough speech there for you?
I think it's great. And I think in many ways, this is actually the polar opposite of oligarchy, which is exactly where crony capitalism is heading. And thereby, before we get into the banking sector, I actually was curious about your opinion about the current controversy about trust busting and big tech companies and other actual major sectors and mergers, with the government on the one hand trying to interfere in some of the major mergers between companies, but on the other hand, the flaws of past trust busting practices also coming to the fore. How do we maintain the balance when we have people from a particular sector who share resources, share the same mindset, share very much the strategy, share share way too much among themselves, and essentially are looking to exercise a control over means of communication, over they're expanding their businesses past their regional companies into various sectors, and they're also looking for political power. So on the one hand, you don't want to stop people from building businesses and giving jobs and innovating. On the other hand, you also don't want a few people who come from very much the same mindset becoming so politically influential through monopolizing various sectors that they leave no room for anyone else. So
Yeah.
how do we strike the balance in your vision?
You're the perfect host because you ask exactly the right questions. I just finished a book not too long ago covering what was happening in the United States in the 1890s up to the presidential election of 1912. Believe it or not, the question you just asked was the one that concerned everybody in the 1890s. These trusts, they're owning everything. Small people don't own anything. We're being forced out of ownership. We're all being turned into wage slaves, or today it's welfare slaves. And Theodore Roosevelt, the President Theodore Roosevelt, as I refer to him, the good Roosevelt, he wanted to break up the trust. They called him the trust buster. The right idea, the wrong tactic. The problem was not the size of these trusts. It was the fact that they were owned by so few people. J.P. Morgan, who at one time was the richest man in the world, a very nice man, apparently, a very good man, but so powerful that most people portrayed him as evil. And in a sense, he was, because he had so much power. Just by not meaning to do anything, that concentration of power caused immense harm to the country. He personally caused what they called the banker's panic of 1907 simply because he wanted to drive a rival bank out of business. This caused ripples throughout the entire world. And so Theodore Roosevelt said, we have to break up these trusts. Well, yes, that broke up the trusts, but the ownership of them was still concentrated. A friend of Roosevelt, a man named whom you've never heard of, Judge Peter Stenger Grosscup. He was the judge of the Seventh Circuit Court of Appeals in Chicago. You don't have to remember that. It won't be on the test. He and Roosevelt were trying to break up Standard Oil Company. And one of the judges ruled against Standard Oil and levied a fine against them. And Judge Grosscup got on Theodore Roosevelt's bad side by saying that this was illegal. The fine levied on Standard Oil was illegal. Well, a couple of years later, they broke up Standard Oil anyway, but Roosevelt refused to speak to Grosscup after that, which was a tragedy, because Grosscup had the right idea. He said, the way to deal with the trusts is not necessarily to break them up, except, of course, when they're doing illegal things. The way to handle them is to break up their ownership so that as many people as possible own them, and they're not owned by just a few people. What we have to do is, as he put it back in 1904, was we have to peopleize the corporation. Ordinary people have to own America's corporate wealth. And what Lewis Kelson, the only problem was that Grosscup did not understand money and banking. He thought you had to use your own savings to buy corporate shares. And of course, Grosscup also said, we need corporate reform as well, because a lot of people who own shares in corporations can't vote them because ownership is concentrated, power is concentrated. A few people can control the voting shares, and they issue non-voting shares. And even if the shares can be voted, the man named Henry Ford, the Ford automobile, he invented it. He also invented the worst possible way to run a corporation. And it's called the business judgment rule. If the board of directors say that the money that should be paid out as dividends is needed by the corporation, they don't have to pay it out. It doesn't matter if the majority of shareholders votes in favor of it. They have to prove a negative. Now, as a lawyer, you know, this is very bad law. You don't have to prove you're innocent. The other side has to prove you're guilty. I mean, how on earth can the board of directors of a corporation, under the business judgment rule, which was put into law by the Michigan Supreme Court back in 1919, Dodge versus Ford Motor Company, they say, you have to prove we don't need the money. How on earth are shareholders supposed to prove that a corporation doesn't need the money they have in their bank vault and should be paid out as dividends? It is logically impossible to prove a negative, as you know. Well, it was the Dodge brothers. You may have heard of the Dodge automobile.
Mm-hmm.
This is how it got its start. Henry Ford refused to pay them dividends. So they said, okay, we're going to sell our shares and start our own automobile company. And they came up with the 1926 Dodge automobile, which was so good it made the Model T that Henry Ford had obsolete. Henry Ford had to shut down the Ford Automobile Company for an entire year to come up with an automobile to compete with the 1926 Dodge, and came up with the 1928 Model A. He lost millions and a huge market share because he wouldn't pay dividends.
Well, that's an amazing piece of history, which unfortunately has, is not quite as apparent as it should be.
No, but wait, there's more. In the 1930s, a man named Louis Kelso was in high school and going to college. Then he went to college, and he said, how is it possible in the greatest, most wealthy country in the world that you have people out of work hopping freight trains trying to find work? He says, this is crazy. Well, he studied the situation and eventually came to the conclusion that the main problem was that, one, you've got problems with the money system. Two, most people by that time didn't own any capital. They were dependent on wage system jobs. Now, you lose a job, if as a wage worker, you lose your job, you lose all your income. If you're a business owner, if you lose a customer, you still got all the other customers. You can lose quite a few customers before you have to close up shop. And of course, if you're starting to lose customers, you better take action. But if you lose your job, the only thing you can do is look for another job. So what Louis Kelso figured out was a way for ordinary people to be able to buy the company that employed them without using reductions in wages or past savings. He called it the employee stock ownership plan. And this was just the prototype. Eventually, what he wanted to see was every single person in the world set up a tiny little vehicle to be able to borrow money, actually create money, purchase corporate shares that legally had to be voting shares and full payout. All earnings attributable to those shares had to be paid out. Of course, this is the theory. How it actually works out in practice, we haven't gotten there yet. We still have to get the laws passed that say you must pay. No, actually, the way to do it is raise the corporate income tax and make dividends tax deductible. And there is a way that dividends are tax deductible in the United States. The dividends paid to an employee stock ownership plan are tax deductible to the corporation. If a corporation paid all of its earnings to its ESOP and from the ESOP to the workers who own shares, it would not pay any corporate income tax. And then there's another way that in the United States, a company can avoid all corporate income tax. There's a provision in the law, subchapter S. You may have, do you know what an S corp is?
Yes.
Yeah. It's basically a partnership with limited liability. It's taxed the way the owners are taxed, not the way a corporation is taxed. It avoids the double taxation. But if an employee stock ownership plan trust owns all the shares, that's a non-taxed entity. So an S Corp ESOP that is 100% owned by its workers through an ESOP trust does not pay corporate income taxes. However, if the corporation pays its dividends, or excuse me, for an S Corp distribution through to its employee shareholders, then they pay the income tax. So the income tax is still paid. No one escapes the tax, but it's not taxed twice. And what Louis Kelso said is all dividends should be tax deductible to encourage corporations to pay them out. And if you want to finance growth, sell more shares. And these shares can be sold to people who will purchase them on credit and pay for them with the full payout dividends, so that people who do not own capital shares now can purchase these shares, pay for them with the dividends on the shares, and after that, get an income from the shares. That way, you don't have to have a job, although it's nice to have one, especially if you want the extra income, or if you're not making enough from your dividends. Now, and that gets us to the banking part. Where's this money supposed to come from? If you're waiting for the rich to allow you to lend you the money to do it, forget it. They're not going to do it. The rich may give you money. The rich may even lend you money, but they're not going to do it in any way that makes it so that they're not going to be rich anymore, or that they won't have a monopoly on power. See, what Kelso said is that we don't want to take what the rich have, except their monopoly on becoming rich. As you know, it's very difficult to become rich if you're not rich right now. Unless, of course, you're Putin, in which case you just steal it. But that we don't want people to steal. We don't even want people to steal from the rich, even if, unless, of course, well, that wouldn't be stealing. If the rich got their wealth dishonestly, and I'll be honest, most of the rich did not get their wealth dishonestly. They just know how to work the system. They got it perfectly legally. Many of them even morally. They just have an awful lot of it. Well, keep it. We just want a chance to get ours. And where's it going to come from? Well, most people don't realize it. And of course, if you're John Maynard Keynes, who thinks that all that exists is all that can exist, this will sound like complete nonsense. But every year, and even in a slow growth year in the United States alone, between $2 to $4 trillion worth of new capital is added to the economy each year. Who's going to own that? Well, if you go by today's financing method, the currently wealthy are going to own it. And this is how you can see people like Elon Musk and Warren Buffett and everything. They become so tremendously rich because they're the ones getting the vast bulk of the new wealth that's created, even if they don't mean to. I think Louis Kelso read about a party in the 1950s or 60s or something, maybe in the 1940s, where J. Paul Getty, who at that time was one of the richest men in the world, attended the party. And he said, even without working, even while he was attending a party, drinking wine and eating canapes and hors d'oeuvres and caviar and champagne, he was making millions of dollars just by going to a party, because his capital was working for him. He wasn't working for himself, except as to manage his property. And once you've got professionals that you can hire to do that, you don't even have to do that. Louis Kelso said he could turn anybody into an owner. Even a wooden statue could become an owner if you just set it up the right way legally. He said people in a coma, people who cannot work, people who are just so old they just can't even get out of bed, they can own. A friend of mine who just died a couple of years ago at the age of, I think she was 94 or 95. She had worked all her life and had invested wisely, and so had enough money to keep her going. Well, that had taken her a lifetime. What Louis Kelso said was, what we want to do is make it so that from a very early age, people have enough capital income so that they can do the work that needs to be done without having to worry about whether it makes them enough money. I mean, how many people today take a job simply because it's a job and they hate it? How many people are driving themselves into early graves because they just are doing jobs they hate just to be able to get the money? Or they sign up for welfare and take money that they know they don't want to be dependent on government any more than you or I do. But it's the only way they have to get money. Why not, instead of this universal basic income that people are talking about, talk about universal basic ownership? And how do we do that? By making it possible for people to become owners of capital.
So that brings me to a question of, I think you're really onto something. I think that was sort of the plan, which is why, corporate shareholding ownership became such a big thing. And it has empowered many people. But what we're seeing now is you have increasingly corporate boards controlled by still a fairly limited number of people, which end up doing, the bidding of very narrow interests and not necessarily what most shareholders of these companies want. And when you try to penetrate the corporate boards and gain power and voice and ability to break through the groupthink, it becomes a huge source of controversy. We've seen that with Disney, we've seen that with the university boards, just recently Harvard and so forth. So what went wrong?
Well, what went wrong was that most shareholders don't vote, or they don't care to vote. The ownership doesn't mean enough to them that they can vote. And some shares, frankly, don't even carry the vote. But the moment the board of directors has to worry about getting reelected, then they will start considering the interests of the shareholders. And if you have a broad enough base of shareholders, that means you have to consider the public needs as well, because the public are the shareholders, or the public is the shareholders. I don't know how to say it. So that the more broadly America's business or the world's businesses are owned, the more the boards of directors are going to have to start thinking about ordinary people, and not just for their own personal short-term benefit. They're going to have to start thinking in the long term. How are we going to feel in 20 or 30 years about this company if we do something so stupid that we may make a lot of money right now, but we destroy the company in 3 or 4 years? We have to, if we've got 30 million people each voting a share for us and determining whether we're sitting on this board, then they'd better pay attention to what the people want. Otherwise, they won't have a job.
So that brings us to the issue of banking, because, banking was supposed to be this mechanism for, uh, essentially lending, and it was supposed to help the economy. It was supposed to help people gain access to capital. Instead, we are seeing that we're seeing a disaster, quite frankly. We saw this in the past year alone. A number of smaller banks went bust due to mismanagement that led a sort of panic. There was a question of whether there was going to be another run on the banks. We're seeing big banks struggle with all sorts of internal issues of various means, and we've seen crisis, like the subprime mortgage crisis, in various iterations thereof since then. So what's going on there? Why have banks turned into this mess?
Okay. The short, almost easy answer is repeal of Glass-Steagall in the United States. The Glass-Steagall Act, which was enacted, there are actually two of them, in the 1930s, separated commercial banking from investment banking. Commercial banks can create money. Investment banks invest money. The moment you have the money investors connected to the money creators, you've got a very bad situation, because you can create all the money you want for bad investments. Whereas if the investment bank has to spend its own money or that of its clients, they're going to be a lot more careful about how they spend that money, because they have to pay it back. But if you can create money Who cares? Now, a commercial bank, if it's separated from the investment banks, has to be careful how it creates money, because if it creates money, it wants it to be paid back. In fact, it needs it to be paid back or it won't stay in business. So what Glass-Steagall did was, prior to the 1930s, banks were often both commercial banks and investment banks. So it separated the function so that you couldn't do that again. Well, when they repealed Glass-Steagall in the 1990s, they put them back together. And one of the provisions was Glass-Steagall was that you couldn't have banks in the same bank cross state lines. And some states like Texas and Oklahoma and Pennsylvania were so paranoid about this that they said, you can't have a bank with more than one branch. They did not want banks to become big. The repeal of Glass-Steagall allowed banks to become gigantic. And the bigger the bank, the worse it's going to get. You have the people in Congress saying, oh, we can't allow these banks to fail. Well, then you can't allow them to become that big either, but they did anyway. Now, the long answer and the more complicated answer is that, unfortunately today and throughout a lot of history, most people don't know what a bank is. In fact, a lot of bankers today don't know what a bank is. You've actually got three categories of banks. And most people think of a bank as the first category, which is called a deposit bank. A deposit bank is legally defined as a financial institution that takes deposits and makes loans. That's a bank to most people. And it's the only kind of bank that they recognize. A lot of Keynesian, in fact, all of Keynesian economics assumes that deposit banks are the only kind of banks that exist. The three main stream schools of economics today, Keynesianism, monetarist / Chicago, and Austrian, all assume that all banks are deposit banks. Well, a deposit bank is like a credit union. It can only lend what it takes in. An investment bank is a deposit bank. It can only spend what its clients or customers bring to it, or it has on hand to spend, or it's capitalized with to invest in securities and such. But that's only one kind of bank, and it's actually the simplest and least common type of bank. The second category of bank is called the bank of issue or of circulation. Bank of issue is the more modern term. Bank of circulation is what they were called prior to the 18th century. What a bank of circulation does is take existing wealth owned by a borrower and turn it into money. They take a mortgage on it, and they use the mortgage to back. In the old days, they would actually print up banknotes. Today, what they do is they create demand deposits, checking accounts. But a bank of issue or of circulation can only take existing wealth and turn it in that exists in the possession of the borrower right now and turn it into money. So that if you don't have enough money, suppose a merchant has a warehouse full of goods and they're not selling because there's no money in the economy. Well, what he does is he takes a mortgage on his goods, takes it to a bank of issue, and the bank of issue creates the money that the businessman spends, gets into the economy, and people use it to buy his goods. I mean, this is the way it works. It's called Say's Law of Markets. Production equals income. Supply generates its own demand, and demand its own supply. Money at the bottom line of money is that money isn't a thing or a commodity. Money is the way I exchange what I produce for what you produce. We've gotten into a lot of trouble over the past 200 years thinking of money as a commodity in limited supply, which means that whoever owns that supply controls it. No, if you can produce something, the banking system was invented so that you can have money to buy and sell and get rid of your goods and buy the goods that other people produce. Now, the bank of issue or circulation deals with existing wealth in the possession of the borrower. The third type of bank is called the bank of discount. The bank of discount deals with wealth that is not yet in the possession of the borrower, but that the borrower reasonably expects to have in his or her possession. See, the first principle of finance is to know the difference between a mortgage and a bill of exchange. A mortgage is a financial instrument drawn on wealth owned by the borrower at that point. A bill of exchange, a mortgage is a past savings instrument, as Lewis Kelso would put it. A bill of exchange is drawn on the creditworthiness of the borrower. It deals with what Lewis Kelso called future savings. In other words, someone who has a good credit rating and a good character can go to the bank and say, I don't have this right now, but here's my plan to get it. Will you create money for me to go and do this so that I can get it, and then I'll pay you back and a fee, and we'll both be better off? And the bank officer says, well, since this is a bank of discount, yes, we can do that, assuming that we trust you and that you're properly collateralized and meet all the other requirements. Now, I'm going to make it even more complicated. Today, as far as I know, there are no banks of issue and no discount banks that exist by themselves. They were combined to form commercial or mercantile banks. A commercial or mercantile bank today is a combination of a bank of issue and a bank of discount, so that a commercial bank can create money to loan on existing assets, mortgage instruments, or on bills of exchange, future wealth to come into the possession of the borrower. Now, let me give you a little footnote here. When I say mortgage, most people will think home mortgage. No, we're not discussing that. That's a whole different category of things to deal with. We're discussing mortgage type securities, financial paper, commercial paper, anything drawn on an existing asset in the possession of the borrower. So the commercial banks can create money for commerce, industry, and agriculture, so that the economy has enough money, the liquidity to keep running. Now, what happened today? Central banks. I can't forget those. Believe it or not, a central bank, true central banking, was invented in 1694 in England with the Bank of England as a commercial bank for commercial banks. Of course, the British would say a mercantile bank for mercantile banks. A commercial mercantile bank, same thing. It was never intended to have anything to do with government. The reason it started having some central banks started dealing with governments was because back in 1694, the British government of William and Mary, Queen Mary and King William, wanted money. And of course, a bank couldn't operate without a royal charter. So what William and Mary did was say, you give us the gold and silver you've collected, we'll replace it with government debt, and we'll grant you your charter. This is how government started dealing with central banks, and the myth started that central banks were invented to fund government. No, they weren't. Central banks were invented to fund the private sector. The government should not be creating money for itself. In fact, the US Constitution doesn't give the United States government, Congress, the power to create money. It does it anyway. No, in the first draft of the US Constitution, it allowed Congress the power to emit bills of credit. A bill of credit is a special constitutional bill of exchange. It means government debt. Now, the framers of the Constitution took that out. They did not want to give the government power to create money. The government has the power to borrow money. It has the power to coin money, but in order to coin money, it has to tax people and then buy the gold and silver or whatever it's making it out of in order to be able to coin the money. So that government was never intended, at least in the United States, to be able to create money backed with its own debt. And yet that's what's happened today. And why we have this gigantic debt problem, and why countries like Ukraine are now in a very bad bind because they need to get money. Well, what's the only way most people think they can get money? Well, we need to borrow more. We need to create more, issue more bills of credit so that, or borrow money from other people who will issue bills of credit to give us the money. The only legitimate way for governments to get money is taxation. But the only way you're going to be able to tax people is if they're earning money.
Mm-hmm.
And the only way today people are going to get to earn money is if they're owning capital and not just wage slaves, because most wage earners are subsidized one way or another, either through raising the minimum wage. Back in the 1930s, when the minimum wage legislation first went through, I believe that the minimum wage may have been 15 cents an hour. Now they're talking about $15 an hour. What is that, 1,000% increase? Are we better off? Well, in some ways, yes, but not with respect to our individual sovereignty. People were more free in the 1930s before all the government programs started. I am not disparaging the government programs. They were absolutely necessary to keep people alive, but they were never intended as a permanent solution, except by people like Keynes and Franklin Delano Roosevelt. President Hoover thought that the same thing should be done that Roosevelt wanted to do, but he didn't think it was constitutional, so he didn't do it. And he also viewed it only as a temporary measure. The New Deal, which has now become the old deal, which is how everyone's running their economy nowadays, was sold to the American people on the grounds that this is only temporary until we get back on our feet. Well, we've been trying to get back on our feet now for almost 90 years. It's time that we had a new Deal, which means what we call the just third way of economic personalism. And the program that CESJ has developed and has been trying to promote is called the Economic Democracy Act. The whole idea of the Economic Democracy Act, and Ukraine could do it. In fact, all you need is the legislature to pass it. Ukraine could do it. Switzerland could do it. Puerto Rico can't do it because it's under the United States. But Montenegro could do it. San Marino, no, wait a minute. San Marino can't do it because their outside interests are controlled by Italy. But any country that has a central bank, and that's almost every country in the world, could enact the Economic Democracy Act, and with the proper safeguards and the right laws, build ownership into ordinary people, build up their income, and the government could start shifting. It can't do it immediately because money is like a drug. Every government on earth right now is addicted to money and credit from the central banks. You have to wean them off gradually and start paying down that debt. But the only way you're going to do it is to have an Economic Democracy Act, by means of which ordinary people can become owners, start earning income, taking over for themselves what government is doing for them now, and start paying taxes, pay down the debt, and pay for government services. But most of all, gain control over their own lives, enhance their own sovereignty and dignity as human persons. Now, suppose Ukraine adopted an Economic Democracy Act tomorrow. The first thing that would happen would be that you have a big educational problem. We have to teach people what this means. But once people understand what it means, that this is a way to have a sound economy once you push Putin out and rebuild the country from the ground up and avoid the mistakes of the past. And frankly, I've known Ukrainians, and they are some of the most entrepreneurial people on earth. Every time I talk to a Ukrainian, it's like, oh, yes, I have my little small business that I'm trying to keep starting here. Of course, Putin ruined it for me, but that's I'll get back on my feet again. We hope, assuming that you're allowed to. What an Economic Democracy Act would be to supply the money and credit for that. As long as the business plan is sound, it can do it. And the government can start shifting from issuing debt to taxation to support itself and getting it off all the social welfare programs, except as an emergency. Come on, there are always going to be people who can't make it on their own. They're going to need private charity. They are going to need government assistance, but not on the scale we have it today. Now, what will happen for Ukraine is that once this plan is in place, even if it's not operating fully yet, it will enable it to keep on borrowing money, enhance the war effort, kick Putin out, and then start rebuilding. People have been talking about a Marshall Plan for Ukraine once you get rid of Putin. Well, the Marshall Plan was all past savings, all donated money. No, let Ukraine use its own money. If the other countries want to help, give loan guarantees, provide collateral. A lot cheaper. I'd rather guarantee a loan for somebody who I know will try to pay it back than to sit there and just give them the money. Much cheaper for me. I may not even have to pay. Anybody who gives a loan guarantee to a sound business proposition, and frankly, an economic democracy act for Ukraine would be a very sound proposition, given the mineral wealth, the entrepreneurial spirit, and frankly, just the people themselves are the best guarantee that an economic democracy act would work. You want to get rid of corruption? Spread around power. Corruption loves concentrated power. I mean, who doesn't? I mean, if I can get all these piles of money that people are shipping in and ship it off to Switzerland in my own private bank account, why not? It's there. But if no money is created until it's needed for something specific, it's a lot harder to steal. And it's a lot harder to hang on to something that you can't steal.
Now, you made a very interesting point. You basically said that banks essentially failed in their original mission by transferring this money-making power into the hands of the government and essentially enabling and empowering government to become the single biggest owner of everything in the US. But let's imagine for a second that that was no longer the case. Let's back up and imagine the banks return to their original mission of empowering the private sector. How would we still keep that from turning to empower oligarchies as opposed to the spread of capital among wider populations?
Well, remember Louis Kelso's plan was that if corporations want to expand, issue new shares and sell the shares to ordinary people. Well, how do ordinary people get that money? They go to the banks and present them with their plan to buy these shares, and the bank creates the money for the ordinary person, not the oligarch. So that by only creating money for expanded ownership vehicles, or in a way that it spreads out ownership, banks don't mandate that the oligarchs break up their wealth, but it ends up doing that anyway. Because the more power ordinary people have, the less power the oligarchs have. And when they can't use their money to buy all the new capital that's being created in the future, what are they going to do with it? Spend it. What else are you going to do with it? We would love for the oligarchs to spend their money, because that would give an economic boom like you never saw. We don't need stimulus. All we need is for the rich to spend their money. But they don't need it to reinvest. We can invest by making ordinary people into shareholders. Make everybody, not necessarily rich, but well off, comfortable, able to have a decent income. See, the ideal would be what most people think of as middle class. You can get your income from both labor and capital ownership, whichever you prefer. Maybe all capital, maybe all labor. Let it be your choice. But nobody has too little and nobody has too much. If all the wealth in the world were more or less equitably distributed, that would happen. This is what Adam Smith saw back in 1776. The only problem was that Adam Smith thought that human labor would always be essential to production. Of course, he was writing at the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, and he did not see the effect that advancing technology has on human labor. It gets rid of it. The whole idea of technology, advancing technology, is to remove human labor from the production process. Well, if most people only gain their income from selling their labor, where does that leave them? Out in the cold. Back in 1855, an investment banker by the name of Charles Morrison said, we're going to have to help workers become owners because they can't make enough from wages to live on. He was thinking only of income. Lewis Kelso was thinking of income and power. And CESJ expands on what Lewis Kelso said by saying, we're thinking of income, we're thinking of power, and we're thinking of human dignity. The dignity of every single human person must be the foundation and goal of every social, every financial, every political program on earth, or the politicians, the bankers, the religious leaders, everybody, they're not doing their job. The moment you start sucking up to the power brokers or doing something because someone in power says, oh, I want you to do this, even though we both know it's wrong, but it will make me a lot of money. Okay, that should not even be a consideration. Anybody who's elected to public office, anybody who's in a position of power should say, ultimately, any power I have relies on all the people I associate with. And if I abuse that power, it can be taken away. Well, the only way it can be taken away is if all the other people have power too. And the only way the other people are going to have power is if they are capital owners. You can talk about giving people the vote all you want, but everybody in Russia can vote right now, can't they? Everybody in the United States can vote right now. Well, if the vote brings power, why are we so powerless? No, we need capital ownership. And the way to do that is reform of the money and credit system so that ordinary people have access to this immensely powerful tool. Excuse me, I shouldn't say weapon. Yes, money can be a weapon. We don't want it to be a weapon. We want it to be a tool that people use. Napoleon used it as a weapon and he bankrupted Austria. But actually, money is a great defensive weapon. And it's the one that Ukraine should be using right now.
Well, you make a very good point, but unfortunately, the way things are going, not only are the current political trends not encouraging passive income, they're, they're actually, unless you're talking about influencers on TikTok, which is, I'm not sure just how passive that is and whether that's sort of but they're actually even restricting the way people make money through labor by cracking down on choices and gig economies and entrepreneurial efforts and things like that. So and that's even in the United States, which is a comparatively open society. Now if you look at what's going on in other countries like Russia, where you have not only an oligarchy and Putin and a kleptocracy, but the fact that entire regions are financially and politically disempowered, with most of the money concentrated in just two big cities in the country, you have, there's something seriously wrong. So the question is, what can be done in such a structure where you don't have any way for entire regions or ethnic groups concentrated in various peripheral areas to make money?
Well, and that's a very good question. And believe it or not, there is an answer. Back in 1970 or so, Lewis Kelso was trying to get legislators to adopt the ESOP. I mean, it sounded crazy. Here's a way for ordinary people without money to become owners of corporations? You're nuts. But he said, but we've done it a couple hundred times. It works. No, you're crazy. It can't be done. Well, my associate, Norm Kurland, I think, oh, yes, he's sitting here listening to me, so I better say this right. After some back and forth with a very powerful senator in the United States, Senator Russell Long, if the name may sound familiar to you, he was the son of Huey Long, who was the big opponent of Franklin Delano Roosevelt. We won't get into that. But Senator Russell Long, whom my associate, Norman Kurland, thought was going to oppose them tooth and nail, somehow got a hold of a copy of Kelso's book, The Capitalist Manifesto, flipped through it, and told one of his assistants, says, I need to meet these people. And within a very short time, and the story is on the story of how this all came about is on the CESJ website, www.cesj.org, under Dinner at the Madison. And within a very short time, Senator Long championed the ESOP, got the legislation through, and within a few years, you had millions of US workers becoming owners of their corporations without spending a cent of their own money. Now, Russell Long was one of these people who said, I think people should work for their money, so I'm not going to take it any further than that. So what we need today is the type of leader who will say, I not only want workers to become owners of corporations, I want every child, woman, and man to become an owner of a corporation. And what we need to do is surface a leader or leaders who will have Russell Long's vision, but on a much broader scale. Now, one of the leaders that we think may be open to this once he hears of it is Zelensky. He's in trouble right now. I mean, even when even the congressmen who support him in this country are saying, what are you doing? Well, we can advise him, possibly give him some information on what he should be doing so that people won't be asking that question. And his background is perfect, not just because he's an actor and can sell it. But I understand that he has a law degree and was in corporate finance or something. So he's in a perfect position to understand this. He'll grasp it right away, or he should. I mean, he's no dummy. He wouldn't be where he is if he was. And he admires the two people that were very helpful to CESJ, President Ronald Reagan. We had something called the Presidential Task Force for Project Economic Justice that President Reagan himself, it was a presidential task force. And it was a way to revitalize the economy of the Caribbean Basin and Central America using first worker ownership and then citizen ownership. Of course, Reagan got 100% behind this, and he called for an Industrial Homestead Act, which we started calling the Capital Homestead Act, and finally the Economic Democracy Act. Well, he ran into political opposition. He couldn't quite get it to move, but he did get it into this public, discussion. Now, the other person that Zelensky admires was Pope St. John Paul II. And believe it or not, we met with him. And a friend of mine says that what we're talking about when we talk about economic personalism is exactly what Pope John Paul II was talking about. And I can't confirm this, but according to my friend, I won't give you his name because he doesn't like it to be known around. He said that John Paul II recommended what we're talking about. We didn't call it the Economic Democracy Act, then we called it the Capital Homestead Act. He recommended it to 3 visiting heads of state. As I said, I can't confirm this. I wish I could. And apparently they nodded and nodded and then didn't do anything. I mean, after all, what's this guy Pope know? What does he know about finance? Everything? He was only under the Nazis and the communists. He doesn't know anything. But not too long ago, I was doing some work with Cardinal Pell. Did you ever hear of him?
Yes.
Yes. And he was asking me, said, can we use the Vatican Bank as a development bank to help foster some development in Ukraine and in some of these towns in Italy that are being depopulated and places in other places in Europe? Can we do that? And immediately I answered, no. The Vatican Bank is the wrong kind of bank. Remember I talked about the 3 categories of bank? The Vatican Bank is actually a glorified credit union and investment bank. It is not a commercial bank. So what I suggested to Cardinal Pell and what we were discussing right before he died, unfortunately, and that it's just like, why did things like this happen? Was let's go to one of the commercial banks in Italy who are run by, that maybe run ethically, or to commercial bank anywhere else, or even discuss with the Italian legislature, because the Vatican City, even though it's an independent country, operates under the banking laws of Italy. Can we either go in with an existing commercial bank or form a commercial bank to be a development bank that would carry out projects like this? Very feasible. Cardinal Pell was the right kind of leader. Unfortunately, he died. Senator Russell Long was the right kind of leader with a limited vision, and unfortunately, he died. Zelensky's still alive. If we can get to him at the right time, maybe he'll see this whole thing that we're talking about and say, this is what we need to know. And he may still have enough prestige with all these other people in Europe and the rest of the world to say, why don't we go with this? It couldn't be any worse than what we, with the two political parties we have in the United States today. I tell everyone I'm voting Whig, because the Whigs last were a political party in 1857. And I say, it's time for a comeback. Vote Whig. We couldn't be any worse.
Well, the two political parties now are basically two different forms of socialism.
Yeah, they would deny it strenuously, but yes, essentially, because whether they want to or not, the government has become so big, it can't help. Well, it's what, did you ever hear of Hilaire Belloc? He was an English writer, politician. He died in 57 or something. Anyway, he wrote a book in 1912 called The Servile State. He said, what governments are going to become are, they're not going to be capitalist. They're not going to be socialist. They're going to be a combination of the two called the servile state. And everybody's going to have to work for a living, whether they want to or need to. And the only way you can get money is either from your private sector job controlled by the government or from the government directly. Everybody is going to end up basically working for the government or for the people who control the government. And we're pretty far along that right now. And what he proposed with G.K. Chesterton, the British writer, was something called distributism. Well, unfortunately, he didn't understand money, credit, banking, and finance, and neither did Chesterton. And he also had a few other problems, like he was anti-Semitic and a few other things, but we don't have to worry about that. What we have to look at is the idea. And the idea is every single person should become an owner of capital. And what we add to that is, in a way that, one, takes nothing away from the currently wealthy. We're saying, keep your wealth. We don't want to take it. And on newly created money that is paid for by the capital itself. We don't need redistribution except as an emergency in a bad time. As I remember what I said, socialism is sometimes needed in the short run, but as a permanent solution, it will not work. And we've seen it's not working. What we need is the Economic Democracy Act. And that's what people like Zelensky should get behind. And with his prestige, I think he could carry it off.
But can this be done in the United States, given the current trends and the sheer amount of interest in supporting this government-backed structure? After all, who wants to give up power?
No one wants to give up power. And it may be hard, but it can be done. My associate, Norman Kurland, he was in the civil rights movement in the early 60s. People were saying in the early 60s, Black Americans will never achieve, political equality. It will take 300 years at best. Well, people got organized. They carried out acts of social justice. Remember, I said social justice doesn't mean doing it. It means making it possible to do it. So that when people got organized behind the civil rights movement, within a couple of years, we had the Civil Rights Act. Now, things are not perfect. They're far from perfect right now, but they're a heck of a lot better than they were for Black Americans than they were. Although the government, with its aid programs and everything else, is busily destroying Black and white families and everything else they get their hands on. Not that they mean to, but that's the effect. That's what happens when you concentrate power. You make mistakes. You end up doing the wrong things for the right reason and the right things for the wrong reason. It just happens that way when you concentrate power. When you deconcentrate power by spreading out capital ownership, you give people room to make mistakes that won't affect so many people. I mean, if you've got 1 million people in a town and 2 of them go bankrupt, If wealth is evenly concentrated, that won't make that much difference. Everybody else can help them. If you've got two people who own a town of 1 million and nobody else owns anything, if they go bankrupt, the town is gone. You have to spread out power, even for your own survival. And the rich should realize this after a while. I think at some level they do. I mean, people like Warren Buffett and Bill Gates, they say they're going to spread out their wealth when they die. Well, one, why wait until you die? And two, how are you spreading it out? Oh, we're giving it to a foundation which will keep it concentrated and dole it out to people. That's not the way to do it. What if Warren Buffett and Bill Gates want to benefit everybody, get behind the Economic Democracy Act and they'll see, oh, you mean I get to keep my money? Yes. You'll just make certain that everybody else has money. Now, the toughest selling point is, as you point out, oh, we're going to lose total power. Well, that's okay because we won't have enough power individually to do anything to you. We will all have to organize against you, which if we did right now, we'd take you over anyway. So breaking up power isn't going to hurt the currently powerful at all because they'll still be powerful enough that they can protect themselves from us. What is it? The best form of government is the one that protects me from you. So yes, it will be difficult, but it can be done. It has been done.
Well, I think it's certainly the sort of constructive discourse that could put it to an end, and the seemingly the race to the bottom between the two current political rivals.
Just 1 second. Norm is my studio audience, and he's saying something that I can't quite hear with my earphones on. Or what were you saying? Oh, this is it's a radio show. It's a radio show. I just interrupted them for you. I'll tell you. You'll see the broadcast. Okay. I forgot to tell him who I was talking to.
Yeah,
Irina Zuckerman. She's an attorney who has a show.
Yeah, I think this is a kind of a very different shift in focus from the race to the bottom, fighting over who is the biggest political victim, to actually talking about empowering everybody regardless of their ideologies, political grievances, and so forth.
Yes. We have a fellow in St. Louis right now, Gene Gordon. He has an organization he calls Descendants of American Slaves for Economic and Social Justice. Not a snappy name. But what he's doing is he's trying to get the people in the north part of St. Louis, the depressed area, the poor area, the places that have been blighted, which is a legal term in Missouri. And he said, we don't need to live like this. We can rebuild the economy ourselves. What we need is our own moderate, within current law version of an Economic Democracy Act. We call the Citizens Land Development Corporation. And the governor of Missouri has enacted legislation to study this and implement it. Now all they have to do is form their commission, do all the other stuff that politicians do that they never seem to get around to. But the fact is, there is legislation on the books in one state in the United States. Any other state can use this as a model. Any other country can use this as a model.
That is fascinating, and I'm glad to hear of such an initiative, because you never hear of anything of that kind. You just, hear about government DEI programs, and that's about it.
Yeah. Well, who wants to hear about people helping themselves and doing good when you could have, people talking about screwy stuff going on the news? I mean, it's not interesting.
Well, I for one am hoping to actually at some point also make a separate broadcast with him to talk in more detail about that very laudable effort and what's needed and what needs to happen and how that can become a model for other cities and areas, because I think that certainly is very promising. But thank you so much for this for distilling this very, very interesting idea to people who probably have never heard of it, thanks to our educational system. And
Yes. Well, if you want some free books, there's lots of literature and free ebooks on the CESJ website. if you pull down the menu bar, it'll say free ebooks. And one of the books is Capital Homesteading for Every Citizen. We're trying to revise it. It needs updating. It's 2004, so it does need a lot of updating. There's also Economic Personalism, which I co-authored with Dawn K. Brohan, D-A-W-N, and it's fairly short. And there's a number of other books. You can get Kelso's book there for free, The Capitalist Manifesto, and also his second book that he wrote with Mortimer Adler, The New Capitalists from 1961, that describes financial changes and the financial system that needed reform. So there's a ton of material there. You could probably go through it for about a year or two and still not get through everything that's there. But the books are free. Although if you want to buy them, they're on Amazon too.
Well, thank you so much. That's really great to know, because I, for one, will be making good on that and looking more into these issues, which I wish had been introduced to me earlier in life, but better late than never. And I really hope that this kind of spreads around, because I guarantee you, it's not that most people oppose what you're just saying. They probably have never heard of it, probably for reasons that are easy to imagine. They simply did not have access to that information. They never heard of it and never even thought that something like that exists. But once they do, I think it may attract a lot of interest. This was really fascinating. Thank you again for those watching the program. This was the Washington Outsider Report on the Coalition Radio, and we were discussing how banking has failed in its original purpose and whether it's possible to use it to achieve positive ends for everyone, for very, very broad portions of population, and not just the select few who know how to use it effectively now. And we'll be back again next week, Tuesday night at 9 p.m. for our next show.